Hello, everyone, and welcome to Make It Mindful, the podcast where we explore how to keep schools relevant by looking through the lens of mindfulness and asking the question, what's really worth paying attention to here? I'm your host, Seth Fleischauer. In each episode, I interview educational changemakers, striving to understand what they do, why it works, and how it can lead to practical, transformative solutions for teaching. This week, my guest is Vriti Saraf. Vriti, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Seth.
So we met in that era when I think everyone was just the only place that they were making new friends was on the internet because there was something happening like globally. I kind of forget because I blocked it out. But we met on LinkedIn in like 2021 or 23. It's all a blur. And I think that the thing we bonded over was like my biggest pet peeve in education, which is when people lecture about how lecturing is a bad way to teach. Uh, and then you chimed in saying that that was the whole reason you were starting to create some alternatives to the teacher conference, which you have done and I have attended on Gather, which has been super fun. I want to talk about a lot of the things that you do because you do a lot of things. But first, I'm going to read this little paragraph about what you do, and I just want you to tell me is this right or not? Okay, just like did I do a good job? So today's guest is an innovator in the education space, the founder of Ed3DAO and K20 Educators. Vriti's companies do three main things. First, they build online asynchronous courses in partnerships with universities like Iowa State and Fordham, focusing on emerging technologies and teaching this content via project-based learning, UDL, and restorative practices. Second, they foster a vibrant community of practice where educators collaborate and learn from each other, with NFT holders accessing not only the wisdom of their peers, but also grant opportunities and international conferences. And third, they are thought leaders pushing education forward through micro credentials, digital portfolios, and other transformative initiatives aimed at reshaping pedagogy. How'd I do?
I think you did better than I normally would do. So thank you for all those added details.
Awesome. So I'm really excited to dive into here to your work. I really want to understand what it is and why it works. And the first thing I'd love for you to do is to paint me a picture. So you talk about integrating emerging technology with universal design for learning, UDL, project-based learning, PBL, and restorative justice. What does that look like?
So the first just quick correction I want to make is we're not pedagogy. We look at many different pedagogies, and so the three that you mentioned are three of many. And so we're
Okay.
also adding things like design thinking, also things like the five E's in STEM or SEL. So we basically span all pedagogies. And so one of the things I'll start off with why we're doing this, and then I'll paint that picture. One of the biggest pet peeves that we have in emerging tech right now, especially with AI, is that oftentimes educators are subjected to adopting strategies in emerging tech in their classroom because of an ed tech tool that their district bought for them, or because it's a really like sexy thing to do that sort of like talks about teacher efficiency or something like that, but it's not actually improving their practice. It's not actually increasing the quality of instruction or the quality of teaching and learning, and it's not making life easier for them. And so one of the things that we often say is right now, especially with the use of AI, we're really perpetuating the status quo in education. We're not actually enhancing it. We're not transforming it. And so what the solution that we came up with in order to really move forward on that was, how can we engage educators with the pedagogies that we know are really effective and have been effective for ages, and reinforce them in a way that they're able to learn them better while also teaching them about content, about emerging technology like AI, and enhancing that pedagogy through that sort of emerging tech. So that's sort of where the idea came from. And we've delivered quite a few courses, as you mentioned, PBL, UDL, restorative practice, all that kind of stuff. So what does that actually look like, right? So right now, what we're seeing in the AI market is educators are learning how to more efficiently generate lesson plans or more efficiently create assessments. And The problem with that is if a teacher doesn't know how to generate a good lesson plan in the first place, then anything you generate with AI is still going to be
Oh,
garbage.
come on, you're getting fancy here. No, 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 no. It's just about creating them. We just have to get them out faster.
Exactly. So it's just it's silly to say and silly to think about, but it is the reality of most education systems right now, where educators are struggling because they're just not getting the right PD. They're not getting the most effective and efficacious PD for their teaching and learning. So what we're doing is we're reintroducing concepts, let's say like restorative practices in classroom management, to educators, and then we're finding really purposeful moments where we can integrate AI into their practice so that it can enhance the way they deliver that pedagogy. And so an example of that is in our restorative practices course. There is something called logical consequences. Logical consequences, if you're unfamiliar with it, the concept is, if a student does something that is, not expected or not, aligned with the class rules, or is a behavior that is, not something that the teacher wants the student to do, you have to give them a logical consequence, not like take away their recess. That's completely unrelated to the actual like action that they had, right? So there's this whole framework around logical consequences. Now, in the past, the way that we've created logical consequences is we've had to like create like these long sort of, maps, or these long sort of like situations where we have to like identify what the action was and what the potential consequence could be. And sometimes we get that wrong, whatever. So in our course, one of the ideas we came up with was, what if there was a logical concept, logical consequence simulator, right?
Mm,
So what if an AI tool could actually help you? First, you understood the sort of like foundational concepts around what logical consequences are, why they work, why they're important. And then we have AI actually help us generate a simulator that will actually help you simulate all the logical consequences that you might need based on a behavior, right? And you can embed frameworks into that so that the simulator is actually matching any of the sort of like classroom rules that you have or classroom expectations you have, things like that. So that's one example of how we can really use AI in a purposeful way so that it's actually enhancing our practice and not just, doing something more efficiently. I'll
yeah.
give you one more example in the same course. So, when we're working with when we're working with students on any type of behavioral practices, empathy is a really, really important thing. And for first-time teachers, it's really hard to get into the brain of a student, and really hard to really empathize with what they're going through. So one of the activities that we have in one of our courses is, what if we created a student persona using an AI tool, something like Character AI or Synthesia or any of those things, and basically had the teacher practice engaging with that student and basically developing that sort of empathy through that persona, right? So things like that we think are a much better use of AI for education, so that teachers can actually like reinforce and enhance their practices, rather than, oh, let's use AI to generate a lesson plan for,
Yeah.
restorative practices.
Yeah. Okay. So 19 more questions, but I guess I'm going to start with what you said last first. Um, Something I'm struck with here is, it's something I've heard echoed over and over again on this podcast, which is like, you don't just throw the tech in front of them for the tech's sake, right? Like, it's more about what you're trying to do with the tech, right? And you have to centralize that in order to be able to make sure that the tech is being used effectively. Um, and I want to in a second get into like how the pedagogies are the right pedagogies to focus on, because you listed a lot of them, and generally I agree, but I love unpacking this question because I think there's some fuzzy answers. But before we do that, I wanted to ask about, um, so like one of my favorite uses of AI, and this is maybe somewhat unconventional, but like when I have like an emotionally heated conversation over text with someone that I care about deeply, and I want to make sure that I like don't come off like pissy and mean, I will like write my pissy and mean message, and then I'll put it into AI and I'll be like, can you just make this nicer? And it is like shockingly good at it. And I'm wondering if I'm doing myself a disservice because I'm not like flexing that muscle and making it so that like I have to like sit with the discomfort of like feeling angry and then pause about that and go into like track into my own emotions about like why I'm feeling this way, and then like really think, okay, have I considered their perspective, like instead I'm lazy, I'm busy, and I just put it into AI and it does it for me, and I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I wanted to say, perfect. And I think that there's a certain amount of understanding that I need to have in order to be able to say, oh, that's exactly what I wanted, perfect, right? And what I worry about is that even like the logical consequences simulator, I first of all, I love that use of it, like fantastic, right? Because it's so good at brainstorming. Like as long as you know what you're looking for, it's fantastic. And one of the things I love about AI is that like it forces you to know what you're looking for, so you have to go through that exercise. But are we making like is it just that we are the age that we are, where we existed without AI for as long as we did, and therefore we can perceive the output as being good or bad? Versus like a younger person, you mentioned that like first year teacher, like has that logical consequences simulator from the beginning, is never going to either like exercise that muscle and or is not going to be able to understand if those outputs are actually good or not because they didn't exercise that muscle. Is AI going to make us dumb?
Yeah, no, I love that question. And that's a question that I often think about and address because it is really important. So, the way that we often frame it is AI going to make us lose our self governance. That's
Hmm.
generally the sort of like phrasing that we like to use. And here's the thing: it's possible, right? Like, so if you look at something like GPS, I don't know how to get anywhere without GPS. Like, there's just no way that I could like navigate myself right now. And so I've lost all of my self governance when it comes to sort of like mapping and spatial like
You live in
understanding and
Manhattan.
all
It's
that.
just a grid. It's just a grid.
You'd be surprised at how confused I get still. And so that's the thing that we don't want to happen with AI, right? Like we don't want to lose our self governance because AI can make so many decisions for us. And so there's two ways that we're thinking about that. Number one is how early do you start with the AI utility, especially when you're a kid, but also when you're an adult. Do you start it from the get go? So do you provide this logical consequence simulator for a teacher who doesn't even know what logical consequences are?
Hmm.
I would argue no, right? So first you teach about what they are, why they work, and then you actually have them develop it. So it's not like you're giving them the simulator; you're actually having them develop the simulator using
Okay.
their classroom rules and guidelines, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is how do you evaluate the output, right? So when you, Seth, are putting, your mean messages into ChatGPT and it's producing something that is appropriate for you, like you're still doing the evaluation and you're still saying, okay, this is the right tone that I want to set, right? Now, the question is, if in the future you were encountered by a colleague or a friend and you didn't have ChatGPT with you, would you then revert to your mean message or would you
I
think
can't
about,
imagine that future. I will
right?
always have it.
Imagine you're, on vacation and you don't have your phone with you or whatever it is, right? So it's like, the question is, will you then revert to being a jerk or will you think twice and say, I probably could say this better. So how might I say this? Here's like some of the examples that I can think of in the past that ChatGPT has created for me. So is it helping you actually build some of that muscle memory, right? So that's the big question. And here's the thing. Not everybody's going to be as thoughtful as you, and some people will revert to their mean messages, right? So the question is, how are humans deliberately looking at the content and the support that AI is producing and really helping themselves become more cognitively um, able and more
Yeah.
cognitively strong by understanding what AI is producing. And that's the sort of reflection piece and the metacognition piece that also needs to go along with all of this. Because if it doesn't, you're totally right. We're losing our
Yeah.
self governance and we're not going to be able to do things without AI.
Yeah, and it's so alluring to not do that, to like just be like, lazy. I turn off effort in this realm when I've got like 97 other things I have to do this hour. Um, you mentioned output, and I want to kind of segue into that initial question that I had. So it sounds like you're somewhat like pedagogically agnostic, right? Like you have different pedagogies that you identify as being valuable things to know, valuable approaches to take. Maybe not for every student, but maybe not for every teacher, but in certain circumstances where a culture has emerged that wants UDL, like if you're going to be doing it, here's how to incorporate emerging technologies into it. But I am struck that a lot of the pedagogies that you mentioned are more sort of like progressive, like in the mode of like changing and improving education. Um, and I'm gonna like connect this to that teacher portrait thing that you are working on, that I think we were talking about before we started recording here. You just got a grant to like develop the portrait of a teacher. We talk about the portrait of a graduate. It's an alternative assessment. Like instead of having SAT scores and letter grades, you've got a portfolio that the student defends with their own ideas. There's some metacognition involved. In that way, it's a way to capture a much larger slice of achievement than the narrow slice that standardized tests can measure. Um, but there's a question of like when you're building the teacher portfolio and what's going to go into that, how do you know that you're focusing on the right things, especially in terms of like what the students are producing? Because once you get away from objective measurements, it all becomes very gray and fuzzy and confusing as to whether or not you're actually capturing what you want to capture, whether or not you're capturing that without bias, whether or not the nature of the subjective assessment makes it so that all of the things that culture is biased towards is just going to find their ways into that assessment. Like, how do you know that what you are expecting of a teacher is actually what is going to help a student succeed in this world?
So I'm actually hearing three questions with the
Sorry.
narrative that you just gave here. And so I want to make sure that I address all three of them, or, whichever ones you want me to. So the first question that you start off with is like, how do we choose our pedagogy? And like, why are we focusing more on the progressive ones? The second question, I think, is about the portrait of a teacher and what that actually means. And the third one is performance-based assessments, and how does that, for teachers, and how does that align with the success or the sort of outcomes that we want for children, right? So those are those are the three questions that I'm hearing. Really,
It was
if you
all
want
one
me to
question in my
just,
mind, but
yeah.
I hear you.
So I'll start from the first one, which is how do we choose our pedagogies? And I think you're right. We are choosing the more progressive ones because we started this nonprofit to create change in education and to really move towards what we call Horizon 3, of what education could look like, which is really like the next version of education that incorporates emerging tech, that incorporates like all the moving pieces of the evolving world. And so the way that we choose pedagogies are really around the sort of more progressive things. And we are, the interesting thing is there are so many pedagogies out there that are really progressive and that are really student centric and that are really about sort of like hands-on learning, critical thinking, all that kind of stuff. But those are often not prioritized, especially in American schools, because it's just easier to do didactic instruction. And so that's one of the sort of like MOs of our organization, which is like, can we actually like proliferate more of these strategies, especially if AI is going to help make it easier to implement it. So that's the sort of first thing. The second question was about the portrait of a teacher. So the portrait of a teacher is slightly different than what you described as the performance-based assessment stuff. So our philosophy around the portrait of a teacher, that we're going to go into a year-long R&D project for in the next year, is basically, in order for a student to be happy and agentic and critical thinking, we often say a teacher needs to be happy, agentic, and critical thinking. And that's often not the way that we actually deliver professional development, or the way that we, create environments for teachers in schools so that they are sort of moving towards those competencies. And then also with the the proliferation of AI and with other things like micro-credentialing and stuff like that, like how is the education profession changing, and how is the role of the teacher changing? So, if AI can do a lot of the heavy lifting for teachers and lesson plan generation, whatever it is, then like, do teachers really need to do that stuff anymore? And if not, then what else are they doing? So that's the sort of portrait of a teacher concept that we're going to go into a long research project with, which is like, how do we define that? What is the sort of, next horizon of education? How do we actually fit teachers into that? How do we like create, personas of teachers that are not just the traditional teachers that you see today? Can we have a grandma be a teacher? Can we have, an industry professional be a teacher? Can we have, micro-credentialing so that the entire city turns into a city of learning? And how do teachers fit into that? So that's the entire sort of portrait of a teacher project. And then the third part, which you were asking about with the performance-based stuff, how do we align all of that to student outcomes?
Yeah.
And the truth is that, the world is evolving so fast, and the workforce is evolving so fast, we're never going to be fully prepared to actually meet the needs in terms of competencies, sort of skills or knowledge sets that students need. And so the way that we want to look at teacher development and student development is not necessarily these are the skill sets that you need, but more these are the mindsets that you need, and these are the sort of like holistic competencies. One of the things, Seth, as you know, I am about to give birth. And so one of the things that I often say is, the three characteristics that I want to develop in my child, knowing that I've been in education for 18 years and knowing that, schooling, in my perspective, is, a highly fractured place, and I'm not even sure I want to send my kid to a school, whether it's private or public. So the three skills and the three competencies that I really want my kid to have. Number one is I want them to be a critical thinker, so that they can apply any concept and any pedagogy and any content to any situation, no matter what they're learning, where they're learning, how they're learning. Number two is self-awareness, so that they understand who they are and how they want to operate in life, and they understand what fulfills them. And number three is social awareness or empathy, so they can understand how they operate in the world around them, and what the world can actually benefit from their skill set. So if we can focus on those three competencies, or those three mindsets for educators and for students, but do it in a way that really just fits into the evolving nature of the world, and also make sure that workforce is ready for these kids and they're ready for the workforce, then I think that's how we want to think about it, not necessarily like, what is the day-to-day skill set that they really need. And then all the performance-based stuff that you described earlier is how that would be, like, it would be backwards mapped to those sort of like concepts.
Yeah.
So sorry,
And
a lot of information here.
no, that's perfect. Thank you. That was, you're such a badass. I just want to throw that out there for a moment. And like, I love talking to you. It's been great knowing you for the 3 years that I have. And I love that you like reflected back to me that there were 3 questions there, took them one by one and nailed each of them. So nice job. The, so, you talked about happy, agentic, critical thinkers. Those are the things you're looking at. The things that you want out of a teacher, out of a student first, in order to have them, you have to have them in your teachers. You talk about critical thinking, self-awareness, and social awareness, pretty related to like those 3 things, maybe not a total overlap, but highly related. And all of these things are like mindsets, holistic competencies. Um, I I am struck by how difficult they are to both teach and assess. And like from a like, you know, huge meta level of like Department of Education. Hopefully by the time this recording comes out, we will still have a Department of Education, but we'll see. But like, even from like a teacher perspective, like, how do I know that my students are happy, agentic, and critical thinkers? Like, what, paint me another picture, right? Like, what does this look like? What does that classroom look like that has those mindsets and holistic competencies?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point to make, that it is really hard to assess those pieces. And I think one of the reasons why they're so hard to assess is because they're not binary, and they're not, what's the word, like in one moment, right? It's
Yeah.
an evolving spectrum that sort of like builds on itself. So like, a kid who is critically thinking in an early stage of their sort of kindergarten career is going to be critically thinking very differently in their second grade, career, right? So it's going to be sort of like an evolving, gradual phase. And so I think that's where the pedagogy really comes in, because I think some of these things can't be accurately assessed in a moment, right? They really need to be looked at as a journey where people are, humans, either kids or adults, are building these competencies over time, and they're actually stacking experiences that will be the evidence that they have these competencies. And so that's why things like project-based learning or design thinking or phenomenon-based learning or any of these things come into play, because they already have the sort of the scientific sort of cognitive integrations, right? Like they already are sort of like thinking about how do you actually create experiences for a kid that will enable them to apply one concept to another and critically think about that. And then how do you use the evidence from that, like the actual like output? Maybe it's an artifact, maybe it's an experience, maybe it's a reflection that will actually show you that in that moment they understood that. But then how do you build and stack that over the course of a period of time? So
Yeah.
I'd say that's how I would like think about all of those things. And then in terms of like what does the future of a classroom work look like? One of the concepts that I've been obsessed with lately. This came out way back in like I think it was like 2013 or 14, but UNESCO created this concept called the cities of learning. If you haven't seen it
I was
yet, you
going to
should
ask
totally
more
check it
about
out.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's super cool. It's unfortunate like that it didn't gain a lot of traction, but they have this like PDF that we can link to the notes later if you'd like. It basically like enumerates what the qualities of a city of learning are, and it includes things like micro credentialing, like experiences that span outside of the classroom. That schools aren't just a place to learn; they're actually a social place, and they're actually a convening place, and the learning is actually happening everywhere in the city. That educators are not just the educators that get masters and are inside the classroom, but they're everywhere around the city. There's just all these really great sort of like these characteristics that they've identified. And that's what I imagine the future of learning and the future of education to be, where like an entire city is activated for your kid to be learning all
Yeah.
the time. Now, with AI, that could be even more, dynamic, right? So imagine if you have like an AI wearable, you're going into a park and the wearable is actually teaching you about the trees. And maybe there's another kid in the park, who is in your classroom or in your sort of cohort, and you can meet up with them and you can have like a little community experience, and you didn't even know that they were there. Like there's so many different sort of like enhancement that AI can create. We're not there yet, but I think we're going to get there pretty quickly if we're able to think about, the entire city as a city of
Can we just fast forward and live in your techno utopia? It sounds
learning.
wonderful. I want to be there. Uh, and I guess, because like this episode's going to come out in probably January of 2025. The country's going to be going through like a pretty massive shift around that time. Like what do you think are sort of like the cultural requirements to be able to realize a a city of, what do you call it, a city of learning, right? That situation where like kids are going around and learning from the pizza maker, like getting their micro credential on like the entire start to finish process of how that happens, how to run that business, right? Like going into the park, or like peering into the sewer and like understanding how sewers work because they've got some AR thing on their glasses, or
Yeah.
some subway or creature pops up out of the sewer and teaches them a lesson. um like what are
I
the,
love that
because
picture.
it
That's awesome.
it feels a long way away. You said that we could be there very quickly, and not in time, not in terms of technology, but culturally it doesn't feel like we have the mutual trust that is required in order to have a situation like that, where you're tossing kids into these like you know um new and unknown situations that probably can bring a lot of learning, but ultimately like require like widespread societal trust. I'm wondering how you think we get there.
Um, so First of all, I'm like dying to talk about the new administration, but we're not going to do that here because I'm so fascinated by like what could potentially happen if
Yeah.
all of the new policies and things like that actually get implemented from Project 2025. But okay, whole other conversation. But the cultural piece I think is a really interesting thing. So there's a quote by E.O. Wilson. He says, society suffers from being made up of Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I think that is going to be upheld for a very long time. The fact that we have this incredible technology that we can really do incredible things from, but because we have medieval institutions,
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of bureaucracy that we're going to have to deal with. That's going to halt the progress of the technology. And because we have Paleolithic emotions, we're going to have all of these sort of like human needs and human sort of like barriers to entry to actually implement
Lizard
all that.
brain stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's going to be a thing for forever. I think those things are not necessarily going to change, and so that's why even if we do have incredible technology, to your point, it might not happen as fast because people are still struggling for power. People are still struggling, with whatever baggage they have, whatever it is, right? Like it will take us time. Now, in order to like have the right culture to implement a city of learning, I think there's a lot of trust that needs to happen. And trust includes tolerance, inclusion, equity, right? It also includes trust of like the technology itself, like how are we
Mm.
protecting students' privacy and data. It also includes, agency for students. How are they actually able to like work with the technology in a way that's not reliant on an adult? So there's a lot of those things that we simply don't have in our society, and that will potentially be in a worse place. I'm not sure.
Might take some
Um,
steps back before we take some steps forward.
right, right. And so I think that is like, something that is going to evolve over time. But what we can think about, if we can't think about like a city of learning necessarily, because like all of those mechanisms and all of those sort of characteristics are going to be hard to attain at the same time. Can we think about small pilot projects? Can we think
Hmm.
about small startup cities? Can we think about small towns where this can happen so that we can actually see it in action and then maybe be able to sort of like, expand that further? It's not the
Okay.
ideal situation for sure, but is it possible for us to like try these things and look to that future in a way that's really hopeful and continue experimenting? Because if we don't, then like, we're not evolving as humans at all. But if we do, then maybe those small pilots will turn into something bigger.
Hmm. All right, I like it. That you painted a picture that I can see more clearly now. Okay, I'm gonna satisfy the temptation. Um, Give me a couple minutes on what we'll say. This: never waste a good crisis. Right? Let's say they execute Project 2025 to a T. Where is the opportunity in education if the Department of Education gets abolished?
So I've read through the education pieces of Project 2025. I think I need to read them a few more times. But the one thing that I think is a potential bright light is that they really want to decentralize the
Yeah,
education system, and they really want to give more power to the states. Now, that could mean some really terrible things for states, especially states that are
vastly
more
different things
conservative.
between California and
Right.
Alabama for sure.
Totally, exactly. So that's and it's obviously going to be a problem for minority students, LGBTQ students, all that kind of stuff, and we need to like make sure that we're keeping an eye on that and making sure that we're supporting our kids where they need support. However, I think it's going to open up a lot of conversations around microschooling, around voucher-based programs, around different ways for students to access more differentiated services that are specific to their communities. And that could turn really ugly for sure, but it could also turn really into a positive thing if we as educators are keeping a pulse on that and
Mm,
providing the right opportunities for folks that need it. And so I would say that's the one thing that I think we could potentially start planning for, which is like, how do we support more, innovative models for microschooling, or how do we
yeah.
make sure that parents understand how to use their, education credits or vouchers appropriately so that they can access the services that they really need. So I would say that's the one thing that I would say if he's successful in implementing, it could be something that could lead to more innovation in education.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, kind of just look at like charter schools as like a microcosm where they're like charter schools on the whole, I think have higher highs and lower lows than like schools, more
Good way to
generally.
put it.
And I think that that's what happens when you like decentralize things, right? Like the purpose of decentralizing is to kind of bring everyone up to a certain standard, but it can also pull back the high flyers. And if you decentralize it fully, we're gonna have some high highs, we're gonna have some low lows, and within that, maybe there's some lessons learned that even with those low lows, maybe that becomes an opportunity to avoid that type of thing in the future. But ultimately, like I question, like how effective has I look at like No Child Left Behind, right, which was like a massive educational initiative enacted from the central federal government, and like you ask most teachers and it's like, well, high stakes standardized testing, like not great for education as a whole, and like engagement of students and agency and happiness and critical thinking, like these things are not well served by that, right? So I don't know, it's again, I think that never waste a good crisis. There's opportunity in everything, and I love your answer there.
I think I think it's also like it's a gradual sort of evolution, right? So the No Child Left Behind thing actually exposed a lot of truths for the
Hmm.
country, like how literacy and math rates were really low, how low income communities weren't served as well, and so all those things were like good things for us to find out. And standardization is not always a bad thing, especially if you're able to provide the right supports for kids who need it, right? But I think we just swung the pendulum too far into standardization, and I think that's the problem that happened. And so now folks are moving all the way to the other side, which is now we need to differentiate like crazy, right? So I think that needed to happen to some extent in order for us to understand the larger problems of our country. But hopefully, we can get to a place where standardization is not the norm and it's more about sort of personalization. But I think that's going to take time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are approaching the attention span limit of most teachers. I do have one more question for you. This episode is going to be released as I am getting prepared to go to South by Southwest EDU. It sounds like the conversation that we just had feels like the types of things that are talked about there. These sort of like bigger ideas, these future looking ideas. You've been there, right?
Yes, I've been there
Yeah.
in the
So
past.
good. So my question for you is like, give me a primer. It's my first time. What can I expect? What's your impression of the conference?
Uh, Well, I haven't been there in a few years, first of all,
Okay.
and I don't intend to go because I will be on maternity leave, and so in 2025. And so the thing with these conferences is, I think sometimes they tend to focus on what the masses really want to see, and although that's not a bad thing, it doesn't actually push sort of like ideas or innovation forward. With South by Southwest, I think there's a little bit more appetite for more innovative things. So I would say the most important thing is like, meeting the people that you think are going to be able to like give you new ideas and change your mind about things. And then being open to like going to those types of sessions. But South by Southwest in the past for me has been like just kind of a whirlwind of just like lots of interesting people and lots of interesting sort of content, but you not being able to meet everybody or go everywhere, and so just like being really deliberate about what you want to sort of like focus on. But I think it's probably the advice that anybody would give for any conference.
Yeah, yeah, but especially coming from you, who organizes your own conferences, and optimizes those opportunities for people to really have those types of connections and talk about some of the things that might not be on the menu at the Olive Garden. Are it's great to hear your advice. So thank you. Where can our listeners find your work on the internet?
So you can go to ed3dao, ed3dao.com to take a look at any of our courses or, join our community. You can also apply for grants to facilitate peer-to-peer learning. And you can also keep updated on any of the R&D projects that we're doing there. You can go to LinkedIn, find me on LinkedIn, Vriti Saraf, to keep up with any of the content that I'm working on. And then I have a Substack which is called Ed3 World, ED3 World. I definitely am inconsistent on it, but hopefully the posts that I do make are helpful and interesting. Much like this conversation, by the way, Seth, this was a super fun conversation. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, and then I also have a personal consulting website called VritiSaraf.com, which I don't do much on anymore, but it is there if anybody wants to check it out.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, this exceeded even my high expectations. I love talking to you. I could have talked to you for another 3 hours, and I probably will, maybe after your maternity leave. But thank you so much for coming on, for sharing your ability to kind of see through the fog. There's a lot of noise out there, and I really appreciate your ability to kind of distill down what's important and then apply that to where we may be going. So thank you for your work, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for the kind words. And it's always lovely to speak with you.
Thank you, as always, to my advisor, Deirdre Marlowe, to my editor, Lucas Salazar. If you'd like to support the podcast, please tell a friend, leave us a rating, a review, subscribe. And remember that if you want to bring positive change to education, you must first make it mindful. See you next time.